Meet the unspeakable Milo Binder. His new self-titled album, produced by the indefatigable Willie Aaron of The Balancing Act, The Holy Brothers, and The Third Mind, is available right now. If you like John Prine, Jonathan Richman, and Tom T. Hall more than Ed Sheeran, then this one's definitely for you. The Unspeakable Milo Binder, available on Heyday Again Records at realgonemusic.com. Future Prophet Records is at it again, filling the charts with all the greatest hits from another dimension, a dimension where great music rules the airwaves like it used to in this one. Swear Tapes presents Crooked Teeth, available right now on Future Prophet Records. That's Future, Prophet Records.com. Order now.
Were other people taking acid? Absolutely. When you say we're doing acid in the studio, but the reality was we probably weren't recording doing acid in the studio.
Right.
That's something. Might have been listening back, but it did give us an opportunity to indulge ourselves in a ridiculous opposite direction than Surrealistic Pillow, because once with the success of Surrealistic Pillow, then we stepped in there producing ourselves. You know, it wasn't Tommy Oliver producing us wanting to get a hit song, and Tommy made an incredible sound come out of that Surrealistic Pillow that holds up today.
Right.
In my opinion, that sound is more significant of a time era than any of the other albums that we made. That use of echo and the sound in that studio, like in sound on Today or something like that, are coming back to me. It's awesome.
Yeah. Welcome to Discograffiti, the deep dive podcast for music obsessives that gives maniacs like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and when I was a kid, I thought I loved music. But no, that was only the beginning. I almost lost my life, and in the process, it made music a top priority in a way I'd thought was completely unimaginable. I quit my job, went all in on Discograffiti, and never looked back. And so, with 3 new episodes each week, you're going to gain a comprehensive knowledge of an act's history and output in the time it takes to listen to one album. Each new guest swings a hard left into an area you either had no idea you needed to know about, or know all about and can't believe you're not alone out there. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on Jefferson Airplane! Along with our special guest, Jack CASADY. This episode is part of a series called Feed Your Head, The Great Jefferson Airplane Deep Dive, which I've consciously crafted to act as the ultimate repository of fact and opinion on one of the greatest bands ever to walk the face of the earth, the almighty Jefferson Airplane. It includes a whopping 30 episodes, featuring interviews with Jack CASADY, Jorma Kaukonen, David Freiberg, and China Kantner, and it spans decades, as one could never hope to attain a comprehensive understanding of the airplane without at least a cursory overview of its starship mutations. By dissecting every fuzz tone, every dosed performance, and every internal friction, we aren't just charting a band, We're attempting to quite foolishly, and may I add quite dangerously, bottle the lightning of a bygone era. An era that, let's face it, was not just a period of time. The 1960s was a rip in the fabric of the ordinary, a brief, beautiful accident where the youth somehow found the master key to the reality machine. And for a few years, music wasn't just entertainment. It was a weaponized threat to the status quo. This, then, will be more than just a chronological trek through a staggering discography, and that's because I couldn't help but bite the bait that dangles so temptingly from the airplane line. in a foolhardy attempt to gain some clarity around what in God's name the 1960s was all about. Specifically, how did the era come to be in the first place, and how could its lofty but valiant ideals just fade away entirely right around the same time the original Airplane disbanded? Going into this interview that you're about to hear, I was under the impression that this might be the only time that I'd get with Jack CASADY. However, after he experienced the mythical Discograffiti effect, a treatable condition thankfully, Jack generously afforded me carte blanche to talk at great length about each of the Airplane's records. So here we go. This is your captain speaking. Buckle in because we're ready for takeoff. In part 1, we covered Jack's life story all the way up to the Summer of Love, just as Jefferson Airplane started making their bonkers third LP after Bathing at Baxter's. Here are just a few of the many things that Jack discusses with Discograffiti in this podcast. The foundational near-death experience with which Jack dealt as a child, Jack's holy shit moment of creative epiphany, his first band, also featuring Jorma Kaukonen, which the two best friends formed back in 1958, who almost got the bass gig in the Airplane before it was offered to Jack, the early gigs and the making of the band's debut record, the profound growth that the band experienced between the debut record and Surrealistic Pillow, Jack's frank thoughts on free love, and the very beginning of the Baxter's lunacy. Also, heads up, typically all you're getting on Fridays and Mondays is going to be the teaser version of the full episodes, which actually exclusively lives on our Patreon these days. So if you're a Jefferson Airplane fanatic, or even if you don't like them but are interested in the greatest and most interesting stories that music history has to offer, you'll want to head to patreon.com/discograffiti and sign up for the major tier, where you'll get full access to every episode in the Jefferson Airplane series. Don't sell yourself short. You're worth it. If you don't believe me, ask your mom. Go there right now. That's patreon.com/discograffiti and sign up at the major tier. And away we go then. By as early as 1968, today's guest had become recognized as one of the most respected bassists in rock. His unique approach to the instrument, what Dan Schwartz of Bass Player magazine later described as an equal voice, supportive and contrapuntal, painting with huge swatches of deep chords, limbing the landscape with melodies and counter melodies, hammering down the bottom with pedal points of gigantic scale, had redefined the instrument's role. Some have described his style of playing as lead bass. Phil Lesh was one such admirer, quoted as saying, "He is the world's greatest electric bass player, the most evolved product of rock and roll bass playing. Even in jazz, they don't play the bass like that." And wouldn't you know it, it's not even his first instrument. He took flight in the Airplane, then cooked up hot tuna licks, 70 years with Jorma, two tone-honed lunatics. Lads and ladies, it's the propulsive locomotive with the dream factor chops, one of the all-time greats, Jack CASADY.
You're sick. You're really sick.
I just love...
You're sick.
I am very sick.
I don't know who you describe, but...
Look, I just love that I got to rhyme hot tuna licks with tone-honed lunatics.
You know, that takes talent. I'm impressed.
I was channeling E.E. Cummings for that one.
God bless you.
I mean, I don't know where to start, so let's just start at the very, very beginning. So right. I want you to tell me if I took a stab at trying to guess your holy SHIT moment of creative epiphany. Tell me if I got it or if I failed. So I believe the moment where your skull opened up and the light came in and you knew what you had to do was not necessarily when you got your Fender Telecaster, when you saved up enough money to get it, but when you bought an amp from a schoolmate and your dad, who had a mind for the technical, took a look at it, knew you'd kind of been swindled, and the two of you built a new amp and speakers, which seemed to have instilled in you the notion that a piece of equipment could always be customized to suit your needs. Am I on?
You described that pretty well. As a point of clarification, that amp was bought by one of my music teachers. My first music teacher at age 12 was Harry Voorhees and taught at a music store in Washington, D.C. Age 12, 1956 is when I began some guitar lessons. In any case, Harry Voorhees came out of the big band area, and so he liked a lot of comping stuff with quarter work and an archtop instrument. One of the other teachers there had a brand new Fender, was playing, and he played with a pick in the second and third finger as well. And he played some of the rockabilly stuff I was liking that was coming out at the time, some of the Scotty Moore stuff. And so I took lessons from him. And he sold me an amplifier. And the amplifier was built in the late 30s, I think. It was something kind of like you'd see Charlie Christian use. It was a Gibson. But my father, being an audiophile by profession, a dentist in Washington, D.C., but as he grew up in the late 20s, 30s, and electronics became to be radios, electronics coming into being in those years, he was really interested in electronics. Unfortunately for him, he never followed his dream. I think my grandmother said, electronics, fly-by-night business, doctor, dentist, or lawyer. And so he went into, he was a dentist. His brother, who lived a few blocks up the street, was the doctor. But his hobby was electronics. So we always had the latest gear in the house, even when the gear was ancient. But it was always the best stuff. And then when company Heathkit started offering a broken down versions of amplifiers, disassembled where you brought it home and assembled it and soldered it and put it all together. That was right in my father's world there. So he loved to work with his hands. His father worked with his hands, Pop CASADY, who did much of the relief work in Washington, D.C. theater halls, up in the ceiling, the molded plaster relief work, coming from the old Irish country. That sort of art filtered down through Dad as well. And he turned the basement of the house, and you guys are on the East Coast, us West Coast guys wouldn't know about that now. But, every house has a basement.
I'm in the basement right now.
Exactly. And he turned it into 50s, which was popular, which was cleaning up the basement. Of course, what the basement consisted of, washing sinks for, laundry, and the oil furnace or coal furnace or whatever heated the house at the time. And so a lot of those basements were all cement poured, but rough. He put in flooring, knotty pine walls, and then made it into the classic American recreation room, otherwise known as the rec room. And so that was the playroom, rec room, where he built Heathkit amplifiers, and, a big 30-watt amplifier. And remember, he put in a big Jensen 15-inch speaker in the wall, all that kind of stuff. So it was all kind of part of my DNA of making stuff. I watched Dad build stuff really well. He had a shopsmith, craftsman. He got up at the top of the hill at Sears and Roebuck, with a lathe and power saws and all that. And then everything he did himself. And he read up on it. He was a voracious reader. He read German as well, because all the medical manuals were in German at the time, as he was a graduate of Georgetown University.
So which was more foundational for you? Was it actually getting your first couple of pieces of equipment or the modification of the equipment?
It's hard to say, because it's all just flowed. I mean, if I hadn't gone into the music profession, then I guess it would have been a hobby or something else, or if I'd found another direction, all of that kind of plays its part if it's able to.
Yeah.
In this case, a couple of important things happened. But after we built that little amplifier, there I was 13 years old, but yet I had a top-of-the-line Swedish Wallensack tape recorder there, and that's what I taped this album on. And Jorma put out as Reno Road.
Nice.
That was the tape recorder I recorded that on, and I got the tapes out, the Shamrock tapes, the sort of off-brand tape of Ampex, and recorded that in the basement in that very rec room. So, in answer to your question, it was, the cart or the horse. All of that was just part of what was going on around me. When I started learning how to play guitar, it was on Dad's guitar. It was a Washburn classical, small body parlor guitar. What happened was I started plunking around on it in the summer when I was 11 and a half or something like that, or maybe 12. And I found it up in the attic. And then the following Christmas, 1956, the guitar disappeared about a month before. And at Christmas, we all ran down the stairs, Christmas morning and all of that. And my younger brother, an older brother, Chick. They both worked with me later on out in California. Chick, of course, has passed away. May he rest in peace. Ran downstairs Christmas morning, and I'm 12 years old. My younger brother, 6 years younger, and my older brother, 4 years older. And there wasn't many presents for Jack down there, but there was a note on the tree, and the note said, Jack, this entitles you to 12 guitar lessons at so-and-so music store up there. And we have your guitar, the nylon, and converted over to steel string guitar, but it wasn't ready in time. But anyway, it was ready, and then I started lessons. And what I like to point out to other people is how aware my parents were of what I was doing. Of course, you're a kid, you think nobody knows you're up in the attic and all that. Well, good luck. They heard me playing right the bang. They got me right off to taking music lessons without saying anything. No big discussion. Boom, they dropped me right in the water, right in the pool. And I'm forever grateful because it set me on a good proper path and good hand positions and diving right on with purpose. So every week I had to go back and have stuff prepared, and it gave me good work ethic, And here's the very book that I learned from.
Amazing.
And in here it says, you can't even read it anymore. It says guitar lessons, right? Can you see that?
Yeah, I can. Amazing.
And then this was published by Gibson, the Gibson System for Guitar. And it says, Melody Lane, start right, play a tune.
Wow. Amazing. I can't believe you still have this stuff. It's incredible.
All my notes are in here and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Learning how to play Peg of My Heart and things like that.
Incredible.
Well, interestingly enough, I left this there, when I moved out to California with my mom in our house and all that. Apparently, when I left California, I forgot all about it. In 1965, I had lent this to somebody else who wanted to learn guitar, and was returned to me at a concert or something by him at a show, like 50 years later or so, 10 years ago, something like
Amazing.
That. So I said, this is great.
So, years before you even got a guitar, something happened to you and Chick that I know changed the course of your life. And during the era when you came up, a lot of people used LSD as a way to connect with the idea of living your life to the fullest. But at 7 years old, you were hospitalized with rheumatic fever and faced down death with a 50-50 chance of making it. So I have two parts to this question. What kind of influence did that have on you as a kid, especially on your decision to really go for it playing music? And even more importantly, were you able to carry that hunger for raw experience into adulthood, or was that difficult to maintain over time?
There was two instances. One when I was, I think, 3.5 or 4, I started having some heart issues, and then full-blown rheumatic fever when I was 7. So one of the things that when they found that you were sick and losing weight and all that is they kept you very inactive. So my first musical experiences that I can really recall are sitting in front of the RCA Victrola, listening to music in the long, hot summers of Washington, D.C., not too different than New Jersey from where you are, only no air conditioning.
Yeah.
But anyway, the idea was to keep me from a lot of activity. So I was too young to read a lot, but not too young to listen. So I used to listen to the radio and listen to music on the radio a lot. And there was a regular programming, on Saturdays, if I remember correctly. It was a lot of Burl Ives and folk music, and on Sundays, classical music, and religious music. That was a way for me to keep me from moving around a lot and, keep me quiet and all of that. Later on, around 7, when I had a more full-blown attack and I was just so tired by my fever, before I was sent off to a facility, then that was it. Again, it opened up a whole, with my mind a little more developed. Then listening to a lot of music really opened up my capacity to listen and fantasize about the music that people played or scenarios or whatever, whether it was classical music that would open up a whole fantasy worlds in your mind that you create along with this music. Like say, that was probably the physical surrounding that would keep me in one place to concentrate like that. So I have to say that it was a blessing in disguise. Fortunately, my father and his brother, the doctor, were able to get me into a trial program for penicillin in 1951. And I was sent out to the Christ child farm hospital and convalescence farm for children. And there was, blind studies, 40 little girls and 40 little boys. And luckily I was part of the blind study that got the penicillin that was just coming out and being used at the end of the Second World War, first in Korea for battlefield wounds to stop infection, and it was beginning to be used for other purposes. And of course, rheumatic fever is an infection of the heart, and it treated it. It worked.
Yeah, thankfully. But I mean, the idea of coming so close to a near-death experience. I know for me, a few years ago, in short order, I got cancer. I had 2 neck surgeries that almost killed me, and I almost bled to death. I had a double blood transfusion. And of course, and this all happened within about 3 years. And there's an aspect of that that's horrifying. But also, I pursued this show with extreme intensity because I was able to see it as the gift that it was, in a sense. So that aspect of things, when were you able to tip things over so that you were able to use it?
I think at 7 years old, you don't have quite the sophistication that you just described. But at the same time, I had a roommate. I was lucky that my father had some pull in medical community. So there was open dorms with about maybe 30, 40 kids in them. And then there was a couple of private rooms. And I was able to get a private room with one other child. And one day I woke up and the bed was rolled up.
Oh, man.
And we all knew what it meant. I mean, everybody knows. I mean, you're talking, the kids are all talking, and parents are all, of course, in those days, very quiet, and nobody says anything, but you all know what it meant. And, you watch various events like that as a little kid. And so it stays with you. It isn't, nothing, of course, back in the 50s was really talked about by anybody in those kind of circumstances. But that definitely had a profound effect. And I, to this day, I remember looking over at the bed, single beds, hospital beds, but then the bedding was all rolled up. Remember, it was rolled up, and it looked like a snail roll. It looked like, I remember looking, well, that looks like a snail. But I knew that my buddy that was in there, this isn't done today as much, but then they didn't know anything. And they were also doing tests. I was in there for maybe 8 months or 9 months, something like that. But a good 4 to 6 months or something, you were stayed in bed, you weren't allowed to walk around or do anything. And so I don't think they, approach it that way then. But I think that was the first profound reality of life and death that affected me that was right next to me.
So what age were you when you were able to use that as fuel?
Well, I don't think that was ever conscious. I don't think ever. That's just part of your makeup and then how you see life. But I did know, and we had discussed the fact that many of those children had died that summer.
Right.
And the success rate of those that had penicillin was much, much greater, and it was a big deal. So I would hear bits and pieces of the professionals, my parents, talk about the aspects of those kinds of, the outcomes. And it really wasn't something that was discussed regularly, or more so that I would overhear conversations that the adults have or something like that, But I think that just stays with you, and that's just the way it is, It becomes part of what you do. And I don't think it's conscious later on. I think it just gives you a little more grit, and hopefully we as adults now look back at it and you try to piece something together, what's a significant event in your life.
To extract meaning from it.
I mean, that's something we do as well. While it's all going on, life is just running by.
Right. I mean, a lot of what we're going to talk about here is stuff happening to you so fast and furious, there's no way to really get any meaning from it, because you'd have to be able to have a moment to think about it. And one of those things is, your brother had a friend named Jorma, and you start hanging out with this guy. He goes to the Philippines, comes back to DC, and you guys form a band called The Triumphs. And your first paying gig is on New Year's Eve going into 1959 at the Chestnut Lodge in Rockville, Maryland.
Wrong. First paying gig is that picture I showed you on the wall.
Okay.
So we're going to have to clarify. You've done a lot of reading, but it doesn't make it right. Our first paying gig, that was October 31st, 1958.
Okay. In Jeff Tamarkin's book, it says that you did play at a hospital for the mentally ill.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That was New Year's Eve.
Okay.
But the first one was October. I think we played New Year's Eve following that. And I cannot remember that facility's name. But the first gig was a Halloween party at a friend of ours in high school, Charlotte Harbor. And we played in the basement that picture is a picture of, with maybe 20 people. And it was like parents allowed the kids to have a Halloween party in the basement, you know.
Yeah.
And we got paid $6. Yeah, no, we got $25 for playing New Year's Eve at that facility that was mentally challenged facility in Maryland a few months later. But the first paying gig was that one. And it made a difference. You know, there's a difference. Every professional musician, everybody can pick up guitar and play or something like that. But if you got a paying gig, then all of a sudden that puts you into a category that was a lot different than before. And once you get paid, you know, then you've got to get your stuff together. You got to pull the set together, you know, and perform. And I think that's really an important aspect because so many people play it today. I remember back in the day as somebody saying, you know, wouldn't it be great if everybody played guitar? Well, you know what? Everybody does now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of playing guitar, do you miss that initial setup? Because Jorma says it was immediately obvious that Jack would play lead guitar. Is there a part of you that wishes that things had panned out that way?
No, you know, I have no regrets at all. Quite the opposite. Listen, I could have made an okay guitar player. There's a lot of okay guitar players. I found my voice with the bass guitar, and that's where immediately when that happened, you know, outsiders, we always joke, my work quota, you know, went up exponentially with that. But no, I love the bass. I love the tonal aspect of the bass, and I love the sound of the double bass in an orchestra going up into the cello range, the whole deep part, listening to the great Russian orchestras and Prokofiev and Mussorgsky and all of that, and listening to those orchestras in Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. I just love that deep, mysterious aspect of the orchestra. Well, when I was able to find that in playing the bass guitar, it just fit. My hands fit better. My ideas were more clear.
Talk to me about the triumphs. If Jorma hadn't left for Antioch College, what do you think would have happened with the band? Give me a fake history of the band.
Well, you know, this wasn't a band that way. Like you think of it today, you weren't forming a band to make a living out of it. Nobody, unless you came from such rural parts of the United States. Don't forget, Jorma and I are all from professional families. Our parents did not expect us to go into the world of music as the number one element of what our careers were going to be. We were still teenagers. This wasn't like forming a band to be great or something. Everybody expected to weed out and figure out their future in college, if not beforehand, and then pursue that.
But at that point, did you have that obsessive quality that you quite obviously...
I had it whether I was building something in the basement or playing guitar.
Right.
And I think same with Jorma, whatever he'd apply himself to. But those are very few parts of yours. You have very formative years, you know, say you're 12 years old, 13, 14, 15, 16. Those are huge years in your development. And by the time you're 16, you know, all my classmates in high school had the various notebooks with the name of the college they were trying to get into already on, whether it was Duke University or something, you know, like that, and planning out their careers. And for me personally, music became really very important early, and so that Jorma being 3 years and 4 months older than as he left my environment there, I finished out junior high school. Well, in that picture there, and what's called junior high school back then, which was grade 7, 8, 9, he graduated from high school and went off to college. I continued on through my high school years playing in a number of different bands in the Washington, D.C. area. The triumphs were no more when Jorma wasn't there. And it was just lasted a year and a half or 2 years, and that's all it was. When he came back from college, we didn't reform the triumphs. Right. He had already started his folk career, and I was still continuing another path. I mean, don't forget, there's 3 years are huge years of those years of your life. Yeah. It isn't like the difference between 25 to 28. We're talking 15 to 18, and of course, by the time I was 18, I already had my draft card, and you were fodder for getting drafted. So there was a lot of different pressures going on aside from all that. But I played in a number of bands.
You played in Little Anthony and the Imperials. You played with...
Well, no, I didn't play in here's the way it worked back in the day. One of the musicians that I had met through a number of different areas, and I have to stress there was different ethnic areas in Washington, D.C. You had bluegrass, Appalachian music coming up through country music. You had jazz and R&B. You had this club scene catered to places like the Champagne Room, where you sort of played Frank Sinatra, Louis Prima Smith, Las Vegas-like music, and there was different clicks going on. But as I would move, luckily, for some reason, I played all those genres, and as I moved, I met many different kinds of musicians. And I met he said it was one of the many, he was African-American drummers of James Brown and other bands in the local area. And don't forget, Washington, D.C. was a huge, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, was a huge hub of jazz and R&B in Washington, D.C. Yeah. You had the Howard Theater, you had all of that. Well, one of the drummers I met, I'm ever grateful to him, and I'm ashamed to say I cannot remember his full name. He took me into a world that I wouldn't otherwise have had access to. And one of the things he did, this was probably after I started playing bass, I was probably 16 then. Well, that's when I started, 16, 17. He took me to after-hours clubs where you play many jazz-like things and different kinds of music, but also gospel events. One of them was their Hammond organ. I'd be playing guitar, I'd be playing bass. There'd be sax, and it got me into some of that world. And it was a huge education, not only of musical education, to move into the different worlds. And then I'd be doing a summer show out in Maryland on the summer circuits playing country music, the state fairs and things like that.
The diversity of your experience is seriously astounding.
And I look back on it, I look like a 15-year-old kid. Right. I mean, look at later on. I mean, then I was in bands like this where good look, you'll love the look on this one too. This was the Medallions. I'm sitting down, squatted down on the side with the bass with the short haircut and the hard-rimmed glasses. Many of the gigs that I had that was more R&B influence, the bands all had three saxes. They'd have a baritone sax, maybe double on tenor, or you'd have a horn, you'd have an alto sax, you had all the sax stuff, and you were playing all the R&B stuff from James Brown to Ray Charles and Bobby Blue Bland and arrangements like that. Because the club scene, everything changed around the mid-'60s. But up until then, the clubs had complete different vibes that they would send out, and you had clubs that were like that, where you played full R&B in it. You had some that we played a lot more swing, coming out of the late 40s swing into the 50s, like Louis Prima. But the sax ruled for a while.
Yeah.
And there was so many clubs, working clubs in Washington, D.C. that you could play. I remember going to a little one down by Key Bridge called Pine Tavern and saw Mac Wiseman there, on a day like today. He passed the time away. But I could also go over for $1.50 in the afternoon and evening, and my friend Ronnie McDonald, who played drums with us in the Triumphs, and then Ronnie played a bunch of stuff with Danny Gatt and all that. He's a drummer and singer. Became one of our gigs just recently.
That was the Offbeats, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He and I used to pal up and go and hear music all over. I mean, there were scenes. There was this gig that Jorma and I had when I was playing guitar at the Rendezvous where we opened up for Link Ray. Wow. It's just that little cruddy, shitty bar, at the Rendezvous, like a dirty front window glass where the band was and all of that. And, this was bare bones stuff and hardcore stuff too. Yeah. But right up the street, there's a place called Vinny's that was country music and the genres and the people that go there were very isolated from one another. You might have musicians that would go and they check out different kinds, but even in the music world, things were separated a lot by culture or race or whatever. So it was coming out of the late 40s and early 50s, getting into the 60s with a different world. Yeah. So that's why I think our generation, Jorma and I mean, in every generation, there's always cross-pollination, but usually on a smaller scale.
Then comes an incredible turning point moment, which I love thinking about these kinds of things. I get lost in thought thinking about these forks in the road. You lose touch with Jorma for a little bit, and the next thing you know, he's calling you from San Francisco with a proposition.
He and I used to meet up. I remember I was 16 years old, and he was on a work furlough from Antioch, and they placed him doing some work in a hospital or something up in New York. And we talked to each other. And by the way you talk to each other is pick up the phone and call him.
Right.
And I remember took my first train ride by myself. I was 16 and a half, maybe 17, I can't remember. Up to New York City from Washington, got out at Penn Station, and my first experience, and we were going to meet up there, and I was going to stay with him at one of his friends' apartments or something, and we'd go around to all the clubs, and we went to Gertie's Folk City, and this was the beginning of the folk revival, and that's where Holy Modal Rounders were beginning, and the folk scene in New York and Washington, D.C., and Dick Spotswood with a Washington label, and Sun House was being rediscovered along with Mississippi John Hurt and all that. And the younger guys like Bob Dylan and Dave Von Rock, some were going in there to put out the music that they would emulate that they had heard on these records. And then there was a few artists that had careers in the 30s and 40s that hadn't been heard of. And they were sort of being revived with this. And all of a sudden, Sun House and Mississippi John Hurt were playing in front of college audiences.
Right.
So I was fascinated by all of this. Even though I was playing guitar and bass and playing R&B and all that kind of stuff, I always loved folk music and blues, where I could just listen to a single person play the guitar, whether it be Lightning Hopkins or Robert Johnson or Blind Blake, and there was so much music would come out of that. Because getting back to my father again, a lot of the music that I found really interesting, 11 and 12, 13, 14 years old, was that music that came out in the jazz world that came out in the late 20s and 30s, where you had individual performers doing that and small combo work. And I always loved the interplay of the small combo work. So Jorma and I would go to the different clubs and hear all these great people and hear Reverend Gary Davis. And I got the chance to hear him. And I got a chance to hear Sonny Terry and Brandon McGee and all these guys playing in that world, which was not world that I was playing. Later on, though, having all of that background, I think allowed me to understand how to insert a bass guitar with Jorma and his fingerstyle picking of the classical genre of Reverend Gary Davis and maybe Blind Blake, right, and Jorma's interpretation of it. And then as Jorma started to write more and more, how to work the bass guitar into what was already a complete music by a guitarist.
Yeah.
So Jorma wasn't playing either lead notes or playing rhythm like a linear guitar player with a finger-picking style. All that music was going on, and as I always like to say, it's like two hands on the piano, not just a melody and then a rhythm. Both were coming out of the guitar. Yep. So later on, my challenge with that to move forward a number of years was that at the time, and I remember thinking about it, as how not to break the groove, how to insert my bass but not have it be too heavy-footed so that it kept some of that lightness in the finger guitar style approach.
So when Jorma called you from San Francisco and proposed to you...
Now we're talking 1965, so
right,
a number of years later. He had moved out a couple of years earlier.
You would stop playing, right? You would stop playing for about a year?
No. What happened was after I turned 18, I took a summer off and went down with a gentleman named Dick Heinze, who was in the offbeats and played as a wonderful pianist and organ player. But his main gig was Hammond organ. He had this gig in Orlando, Florida. And he said, "You want to do this gig with me?" And I said, "Sure." So I got in my 50 Pontiac I had at the time. But I went down to Florida, to Orlando that summer and met Dick Heinze. And that gig that he had started at 2:15 in the morning and it went till 4:30, an after-hours club. And so I walked into this one bowling alley place where a band was playing. So get this, you're on one side, you have the bowling at 40 lanes, brash, and then a big plate glass partition with velvet curtains. And the other side, the bar. Okay, in the bar is a semicircle, half around like this. Above that is the bandstand, which is like a postage stamp half moon shape on it. You climb up, and so the band, which consists of no more than 3 pieces at one time, because they're so small, was above the bar, and you look down on them, people making drinks and whatnot, and that's where the bar was. And I walked in, I said, "Can I sit in?" I sat in with him. And they liked me so much, embarrassed to say, they fired the other player on the spot hired me.
Nice.
So then I had a gig going from 8 at night to 1:15 in the morning, and hot-footed over to the other place.
What year was this? Is this 65?
1962.
Okay.
Coming back after that gig for the summer, there now I turned 19 years old. I had my summer off, but at 19 years old, I had my draft card since I was 18. If I didn't get back in school, I was in the Army. It's just automatic. Vietnam 62 was starting to heat up. Because my older brother had gone in. He'd volunteered because he believed that they told him, you can pick wherever you want to go to and all that kind of stuff. He ended up being a medic in South Carolina all the time, And he sent me these long letters, Chick, with, don't do this, don't do that. They lied to you, duh. In any case, so I got back into college. I went to Montgomery, what we call Montgomery Junior College, and my grades weren't the best to get into Maryland, but it was a stepping stone to get your grades back up together to get up into that. So I was back in college, and in college, junior college, I was doing a bunch of things. As it turned out, 1962, when I had to do like a thesis or something like that, I picked the child ballads of England to do, and I would go down to the Library of Congress and research all the English ballads and how they were transported over to the Appalachians by the English settlers and how it morphed up into Appalachian music and folk music in America. But at the same time, that was keeping me pretty busy, and I was still playing on the weekends, but still I couldn't get out of that rut of playing other people's music. It was a down period. I didn't stop playing at all, but I wasn't. I was kind of like in a no man's land. Where do I go from here? Because there was nobody encouraging you to write and do your own thing. That didn't exist.
Right.
Now, there I am. I'm about to transfer over to Maryland in the summer of 1965. Jorma's been out playing folk music and finishing out college himself, 3 years ahead of me. And we talk. We have a mutual friend, the banjo player, buddies of ours, a guy named Bob Linder, Lindner. We had a phone conversation one night, and we're all passing the phone around about friends and all that. And I remember Jorma asked, he said, I told what I'm doing. Still playing, working, trying to stay away from the draft, going to college. And he says, well, I've just joined a group of people. This was like a month right after it formed in August of 65, toward the end of August, maybe September. Yeah, just a few weeks after we'd done this. And I remember at the time he said, you're playing guitar? I said, yeah, and I'm playing bass and all this stuff. He said, yeah, you're playing bass. I know. And he'd never heard me play bass. He said, I'm not really happy with a bass player. And we talked about it. We had a couple more conversations. He said, let me call you back. He says, listen, what do you think? How about if you come out here and try out and play bass for the project here, more or less, however that was put together. And we discussed it. He called me back and says, listen, they're going to go for this because I told them I wanted a different guy, and I knew a guy. So I was just about ready to start. And then by that time, a couple more conversations, phone calls later. It was September, middle of September, I was about to start school. And he says, listen, we got a guy, the band has a manager that promises to pay us $50 a week, whether we're working or not. I said, you're on. So with a leap of faith. And that's all it was. There wasn't anything else to discuss. They hadn't had a record contract.
Two questions about that. So when he did initially pitch it to you, he had first talked to Peter, his brother, about being in the band, but Mr. and Mrs. Kaukonen weren't okay with it. So then they came around to you.
I wouldn't know that because that's a conversation you have to have with Jorma. I didn't know anything about that.
That's in Jeff Tamarkin's book, is that first it was offered to Peter, and then the idea with Jorma's parents of two people in music in the family was too much to bear, and they shot it down before he could say yes.
You'll have to discuss this with Jorma because I can't comment about anything.
But what I want to ask you about is when he proposed to you before Matthew Cates said that you would get paid either way, from what I understand, you considered it. You said, I'll think about it. Do you remember the process, the decision-making process?
Back up. Yeah, it was so primitive, what you were thinking. This isn't, this wasn't like, a major, this wasn't a process that required many steps.
Well, you didn't say yes right away. Is that right?
I can't even remember. I mean, you just look at the timeline. He did his thing with them in August. I talked to him toward the end of August. And in September, I got on a plane and went. October. Got on the plane and went out.
So I read as you disembarked at San Francisco International, Jorma told you, "I sure hope you can play."
Exactly, because he'd never heard me play.
Right. Were you at all nervous? I mean, this was a leap of faith.
I don't think. No.
No?
I was not. I mean, it wasn't, there wasn't anything to be really, we were so young and naive, there was never to be nervous about it. I wasn't nervous about whether I could play well or not.
Sure.
I was curious. I mean, I'm sure I was concerned. I didn't get nervous. I did. It was all new. I hadn't even flown on a plane, so, and I'm coming out to San Francisco. The life decision was much more daunting, I think.
Right.
I mean, it's just the kind of stuff that's kind of like, I remember the first time I wanted to ski, I went out and got a pair of skis, put them on the car and drove off to the nearest little mountain in the wintertime and got on the slopes and skied. I didn't overthink it too much.
Obviously, you fit in perfectly in the band, but when you first got
I don't think that wasn't obvious. I was from D.C. I was quite different culture than the West Coast culture. Mm-hmm. All of that, I think, I didn't realize what their response was, and I think in the beginning, I certainly didn't look like the kind of guy, say, that Paul Kantner wanted me to be like, coming maybe a little more with influence out of his folk world or the Byrds or something like that. I mean, it all changed pretty rapidly after that, and I got into the culture that was started out here. But I didn't have any idea what was going on out here. Everything was still very regional in the United States. A scene that was going on in New York, or a scene that was going on in Washington, D.C., or a scene that was going on in Philadelphia with the music, in Nashville, Los Angeles, and then San Francisco. There was no cross-pollination of all that. Nobody knew what the other guy was doing. I mean, I used to hunt for records of West Coast jazz scene with Stan Getz and all of that. That wasn't played on the East Coast, Yeah. And the East Coast New York jazz scene stuff wasn't played out on the West Coast. I mean, it was you had regional hits, that didn't go nationwide.
I meant that you fit in perfectly. Retrospectively, looking back, you were absolutely the perfect guy to be playing bass for the band. But when you first got out there, weren't you rubbing Paul the wrong way? You had a mustache.
But I mean, everything, it wasn't as critical as you guys make it now when you talk back on it, It was just like, we laughed about it and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I looked, by his standards, pretty nerdy, because I was. I'd just come out of college, had a tweed jacket and all that kind of stuff.
Didn't you shave half the mustache?
Yeah, I did for funny. He said, I'd really like you to shave the mustache. I didn't like anybody telling me what to do at all. So in that way, I really figured in well with the band, because that's how those guys work.
Exactly,
And I shaved it off. I said, here, you can look at this side. I think you saw my sense of humor then, and it all worked out pretty well. There was never, all the years that we were together, which wasn't a huge amount, 7 years with the Jefferson Airplane, all that, we'd have long drawn out discussions about how to do a song or something like that. There was never any, it wasn't like we came out of the background of where we boiled over into knock down, drag out fisticuffs on the floor, things like that. We weren't like some of the bands that really got at each other's throat. Everybody had an intellect. Nobody came from an improvised background or anything that was in the Jefferson Airplane, that's for sure.
Yeah. So October 30th, 1965, the Harmon Gym at the University of California, Berkeley.
Yeah, I came out on the 16th, I think, and we rehearsed a couple of weeks, and then I played that gym gig that you so kindly put me in touch with a ticket stub.
Just so people know who are listening, you played that gig. It's your very first gig in Jefferson Airplane history.
$1.
Amazing.
The ticket price, $1.
And you did not have a ticket stub. And I saw on Facebook that Billy Dean Andrus's nephew, Bobby, had a ticket stub. And he so graciously said that it was okay if you had it. He didn't ask for any money. And just to play that tiny part in being able to close the circle of history.
Well, make sure you give him credit in your podcast, buddy.
Oh, absolutely. I'm thrilled that you have it. I probably am more thrilled than you are.
No, it's very cool. It really is. I mean,
Yeah.
it really, and so no doubt about it. That changed my professional life.
Yeah, that night was huge.
The beginning.
Yeah.
It was huge because there are many talented and great and hard-working people in all professions. But if you're a research scientist, you still have to have backing in a lab to do your work, and you have to have an environment in order to put the concentration in to come up with a result.
Right.
And the same with me. It was frustrating. My growth period had really stopped because I'd learned a lot on the instrument. I had played a lot of different stuff, and I had messed around with, it was all other people's music. And at the same time, I was manipulating and changing the lines and doing all that kind of stuff, but I didn't really have a place to do it. The Jefferson Airplane gave me that place and much more. The format of the bands were brutal up until the 60s. There was no such thing as a band that was formed and put together where everybody was equal. Didn't exist.
Yeah.
There was a leader, sideman, and it was brutal. A sideman could be hired and fired and all of that. The leader took all the credit and whatnot. Even when records were put out by various singers, the bands that went out on the road were hired musicians for the gig. They went to top-notch guys to play the records in the studio and whatnot. So it was a brutal world. What I entered into was a world where it seemed perfectly natural for the players of Jefferson Airplane, for then Signe Anderson, then later on Grace, Paul Kantner, Jack CASADY, Jorma Kaukonen, Skip Spence, later on Spencer Dryden, for us to be the masters of our own universe.
Yeah.
So here I was thrown into a conglomerate of musicians that would have never been put together if a leader was picking out a band to back him up or to work on material. Because, Paul came from his folk background playing a 12-string guitar, which is very kind of a cumbersome instrument working into the folk rock world and then basically called rock.
Especially
and
Skip.
He liked his harmonies and whatnot. Skip hadn't been a professional drummer that was playing drums and was a frustrated songwriter.
Marty just thought he looked like a drummer, give it a little break here. Nobody hires anybody. Nobody does anything because really what they just look like. Skip could play drums. Absolutely.
Don't forget that. Slow down. When you read all these cliches and you throw them out there from stuff that you read before, take it with a grain of salt because, that's a quip that somebody says, and there's a writer in the room, and then all of a sudden it's put into a book, and it's like gospel. So you've got to understand the way things come out when people are trying to pin down, well, why'd you pick Skip? Because he looked like a drummer, but it was so much more than that. Because believe me, he wouldn't have been playing drums if he wasn't really a very talented guy. Musician.
Sure. Isn't it true, though? Because I know that Marty hired him on the spot from playing with a nascent version of Quicksilver, but he didn't hear him play drums. He said, go learn how to play drums. I'm sure if he was terrible, he wouldn't be part of the band. But he had not heard him play drums.
I can't comment on that because I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But in any case, it really, the Jefferson Airplane, nobody ever told me ever what to play on bass. Yeah. Nobody ever told anybody. You worked it out by consensus when we started recording. We got the tracks done and listened to it back.
So
but everybody was growing, and I think that's one reason the band was accepted for as long as it did, and also one reason the band only lasted as long as it did because there was four songwriters and different approaches. And everybody's young and moving out, and they're kind of like spreading out like ripples in a pond.
Yeah, so, I can't believe you guys lasted as long as you did, honestly. That is a miracle. Now, the first record, Jefferson Airplane Takes Off. I'm curious, and I'd love to do this with the records. What I do on the show, I know it's reductive, but I rate every record from 0 to 5 stars. So I'm just curious, from the vantage point of yourself in 2026, looking back on the debut, which I think is one of the great debuts in rock history, how many stars would you give that record, and what are the highlights for you?
I'm gonna rate it with stars, but I'll tell you my experience with it. What was great, and don't forget, back in this day, even though I had a tape recorder and I had tape recorded Jorma and whatnot, I probably had more experience with a tape recorder than anybody else, but I wasn't really recording myself a lot at all, not like they do today. I put it over here on a little stand anytime I got an idea. I wasn't doing it then. It was really the opportunity to get into the studio. You went to where the recording equipment was, which the studios had. And in our case, living in San Francisco, 400 miles north of Los Angeles here, you had to go down to LA where the studio was. You went to Los Angeles to record, you went to Nashville to record, you went to New York to record. It was the opportunity of us to record. And like most first bands that make their first records, when I came out and started in earnest, rehearsing, we were getting attention towards the end of the year and playing our sets and we were working on our sets and turning material over at the Matrix, which was a little club on Fillmore that Marty had part ownership to. And that was really advantageous for us because we had a gig. Because don't forget, it's hard to get gigs.
Right.
And consistent gig where we could work 4 nights there, work on a bunch of material, and go away, rehearse a couple more, where you can come back and play a few nights there and work on a bunch of material. And that was really important at the time for learning how to play. Jorma, at that point, hadn't played electric guitar. He'd played, acoustic guitar, so he was getting his nascent learning experience on the guitar. And the vocal harmonies were very important to Paul Kentner. So the band, the singers, Paul Signey and Marty, could really work on the material. That way, the rhythm section worked itself together. And by the time we got to record, we got a recording contract around November, and it was signed. We went down after the first of the year, early 1966, to record our first album at RCA. But basically, we did that in 4 days, and we recorded it on a 3-track. Mm-hmm. 2 tracks stereo and 1 track to bounce. And you went in there and recorded basically your set that you played in person, songs you played in person,
right.
And everything played live. So that was a chance to hear the band back. First chance we really got to hear in full fidelity back in the control room what we sounded like together, what the interaction was, and everybody's, of course, concerned with how they visually play and how the band's all working together and melding together. So it was a tremendous boost. At the same time, I think everybody thought, boy, we really got a lot of work to do. You hear how your technique is, and you hear how well you're doing stuff. And my train of thought was always, how can I improve it, sound better, get more clarity, and all of that. And so to me, it was a very important record for those reasons.
Do you ever go back and listen to it?
Yeah, we listened to it. I mean, usually it takes an event. Yeah. The last time we did, I think, really gave everything a really good listen. When we did the 50th reunion, Jorma and I went out with G.E. Smith, and we did a bunch of material from the Airplane that we hadn't played before. And went out with Rachel singing the lead vocal. And we hadn't played any of those songs in 50 years. And so we had to sit down and listen to all of them to figure out what we were going to put into the set.
What did you think about it, listening to it?
I thought it was really great. It was really good. I was surprised at how good listening to myself play as a 21-year-old.
Yeah.
Now, by today's standards in bands, like people start earlier, I was the youngest guy in the band at 21. Or maybe skip off, I can't remember. But I was 21. I just turned 21 in April of 65. But, I was also at the same time impressed with how good a sound and how clear my playing was. I mean, the big deal was being able to ride around in my 57 Volvo and hear It's No Secret on the radio. I mean, that was the big deal.
Yeah.
When that was played regionally. Now, it wasn't played across the United States, like I said before.
Right.
You still had regional hits. Had people played on the West Coast stations, but wouldn't make it to the East Coast. And so that was a big deal. I remember us all crowded in the car listening to it as it came on the radio. And, you couldn't just punch it up on the radio. It's whenever it came on the radio. And so you listened all day long to local stations to see if they're going to play the record.
Beyond just the single type material on it, the way that you cohere and already have a sound, obviously the sound is going to metamorphosize and really develop, especially by the time we get to Baxter's. But, oh my God, this record, it's astounding to me how much of a vibe there is on this record. It is not just a collection of songs. It is it coheres as a singular
that's what
statement.
I said.
Yeah.
That was the big difference, I think, in that as we developed the songs, everybody really developed their own playing.
Right.
So we weren't given a song structure like they would hear by the pros working in the studios that would come in with a song, with a singer, and then the band that would back up top-notch players, that would play here and then construct the arrangement together to fit the song. we were responsible for everything out there, for do or die, sometimes more successful than others. But still, with that mindset, you really put a lot of your emotion aspect into trying to really form and put together a cohesive part. At the same time, work with the three-part harmony, the vocal, that sound. But I think Paul was the architect of the Jefferson Airplane sound being such a huge vocal presence.
Right.
We did our work with the instrumental. I did my work on the bass to break out of certain norms. Jorma did his work on the guitar. But the overall sound of Jefferson Airplane definitely was that huge vocal sound, with a lot of bands didn't have that sound.
What do you think of the highlights on the record?
Well, just like what I said, I think the highlights of the vocal sound, and there are things that I can pick a chalk on the songs, but I'm not really, I'd have to look at it.
When I think of the record, I think of And I Like It, and I think of your lumbering bass sound.
That was like, I was using open D tuning and going up to a chord slightly, two-note chord movements in it. That was a little different for the bass at the time, that it played, And it was all just natural. I started playing the song out like that, and it was kind of like a call and answer between Marty and I. He'd say, I don't like it, and I'd follow with the bass. But that's pretty much my approach. I always loved to listen to singers, no matter what band. Even when I was playing material that was, cover material of songs, I always liked to work off who was singing the song. The song has always been really important.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't think that is because I move so many melody notes around and all of that. But to me, it's more like, for want of a better word, more like a jazz conversation between me and the singer, as a jazz player would approach it. But I wanted to do that in the format that I was given, and that's how I approach a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So after that record comes out and, Signe leaves and wants to devote her time to her family, it always struck me, and I never have read anything about this, and so I'm so curious, when you asked Grace nonchalantly in September if she'd consider joining the Airplane, it didn't take more than a minute for her to answer, apparently.
Well, don't forget, this was nonchalant at all. We didn't have a singer. There was nothing nonchalant about it, ever. Grace was one of the other bands in San Francisco. So you went over, and we all listened to each other. We all went to the Grateful Dead shows. The Grateful Dead guys came over to us. We went over to the Great Society, and they were playing at the Avalon Ballroom. And that's when I approached Grace about it. But she and I, we've had conversations before, not about necessarily joining the band, just about, the other guys in the band. And another band, you talk to each other. It was a very close-knit community with a lot of time on your hand, and you're young, and you're learning your instrument, and you're just getting your feet on the ground with the band that you're in. So everything is very new and in front of your face.
Can I ask you a quick question, though? This is
sure.
The aspect of it that I always wondered about is you're brand new in the band, so it just seems ballsy.
I wasn't brand new in the band then. The band was only together a month and a half before it came out. By that aspect, this was after we recorded, and we've been together for a year, and the Fillmore was starting all of that. There's nothing brand new about it.
Did you run it by any of the other guys in the band first, or did you?
Of course we did. We all
okay. I didn't know if it was your decision and you just asked her.
No, it wasn't. No, it was. Okay. She was the other. No back. Who can we get? Well, there's Grace over there.
Yeah.
It doesn't take it.
No, not at all.
In mental giant to figure that out. Yeah. I was really aggressive about going out and listening to everybody that I could and all of that.
Yeah.
So that might have played a factor on, because there was a lot of trauma with Signe leaving. And it was very upsetting and back and forth and whatnot. And then once that became obvious that was the path that she was headed, then, oh my God, what are we going to do? We just got a record contract, we have to lose our female singer. So, there was nothing nonchalant at all. And so we were rehearsing, and I think we might have been using part of the Fillmore to rehearse in those days. Bill Graham had let us as a place to rehearse, and they were playing. We talked about Grace, and they're playing this weekend. I'm going to go over.
Yeah. You know what's crazy to me?
Our so-called meetings are like in between songs,
Right.
I mean, we didn't have a power meeting or anything like that. We were able to talk standing up on our feet.
You know what's amazing?
When I went over to listen to Grayson played, they took a break at the end of the evening. We got a moment together on the side. I said, listen, we're rehearsing tomorrow. Why don't you drop by?
A lot of people who are even fans of the band, they don't realize that from the moment she joined the band to when you guys are recording Surrealistic Pillow is 2 weeks. And when you listen to, for example, Tobacco Road from the first record, and then you hear the very first moment of you guys in the studio together, which is She Has Funny Cars, it's like two different bands that have almost nothing to do with each other. There's so much.
Yeah, but a lot of time had gone between those two. Like I said before, while we were developing material and all that, when we recorded the first album, that was pretty much wrapped up that sound.
Yeah.
That wasn't 2 weeks later that we went into the studio to record Surrealistic Pillow. A whole year had gone by.
From that, but not from Grace joining.
But we had played every single day, working on what would develop into a new sound. So all of our chops were a lot better. All of our chordal progressions had moved around a bit, and people were really trying to move away from recording anything that had been recorded before to write new material. And then when Grace came in, she dropped in with a couple of songs right away that turned out to be a turning point for the career of Jefferson Airplane. Absolutely.
One of my favorite things about the band, though, is after those two songs, her contributions to the band are so completely off the wall, surreal, and purposely uncommercial. It's one of my favorite aspects.
Well, I'll say, but nobody purposely makes things uncommercial. It isn't that way. That's the way the music was. That's the way you write what's in your heart, and you write right at it.
Not everybody does. Not everybody writes what's in their heart. Yeah.
But in any case, yeah, of course. But nobody sat down to say, let's write a purposely uncommercial song. What are you, nuts? We're trying to make a living here. Nobody can pay the rent.
Well,
everybody would love it to be commercial. But the commercial is merely whether somebody buys it,
Yeah.
Not whether it's accepted as a commercial song or not. We really didn't think about that. But sure, do we want to hear it on the radio? Absolutely. But be that as it developed through the lifespan of the band, we found something else to hook our hats on, which was developing the music, the lyrics, and the direction we wanted to as a band, because we started to have people that would come to concerts, and that's what supported the band.
Right.
And a lot of times you can't. It's the opposite. You got a song out there and you put a band together to support the song's radio play. When we started to be able to support ourselves through in-concert performance, the audience became the hub by which we worked through, rather than the ability to sell the records. And also, instead of singles being live or die by a single, whether it would get played, the album concept became much more important to us as a statement of a cohesive unit on an album, rather than just a collection of singles like it had been in the early days.
So tell me about Surrealistic Pillow. How do you view it from your vantage point now? What are some highlights for you of that record?
With the big leap with Surrealistic Pillow, and also coming off, its success of the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper and all that, was the ability to go in studio and create in the studio. We'd never really done that and use it. So that record, I think, took 3 weeks, but we went into the studio with songs that were partially put together, and some, like White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, that were put together much more, but we honed in the studio, and songs that were literally just written and brought into the studio to arrange and put together completely in the studio. So that was a big leap for us. I think we recorded all 2 or 3 weeks of that album. But the big leap of faith there was to arrange and work on your parts and hone that and get a take and get that done. And also from Paul's point of view, that moved up to the new 4-track recorder, which allowed you to not lose generations of sound quality by overdubbing, but allowed the harmonies to be worked on and a track laid down with the harmonies to various songs to change the way records had been made.
I find it interesting that, Surrealistic Pillow is such a big step forward in the evolution of the band, But the decision to kick the album cycle off with a conservative bet like My Best Friend as the single, which I love that song, but...
Well, we had producers, and that producer, they're in a record company, they're looking for something that can get played on a record,
Yeah. But I mean, it's a conservative bet that wound up not taking off, so the record just kind of sits there for a few months, and then it really starts taking off once the right singles are released. But it's a very interesting idea for not only My Best Friend and that type of song to lead the charge, but also a songwriter who's no longer in the band having the lead single is just...
Well, that's interesting, and from your point of view, at the time that was going on, those weren't major events that you described until, Somebody Loved White Rabbit came out, and that moved us across the country.
Right.
Those two songs moved us across the country, so we could finally go. I mean, we went back to New York in the first album, had a promotional deal with RCA and whatnot, but this moved us across the country to start playing shows on our own, and people were curious about all the goings on in San Francisco. That began that year of getting the real exposure according to all that, and that really mushroomed over the next couple of years.
Now, I know you guys all had different priorities, and you're very different people in the group. Because you guys had such countercultural ties and were so endemic to San Francisco, were there people in the band who really could not give a crap about hits, about being pop stars, and just wanted to...
Well, I don't think anybody thought about being pop star, but don't forget, you had the Byrds that had immense popularity, and Paul Cannon was really enamored with them. He'd love to get a hit. Course.
Yeah.
But I think it was pretty obvious that we also wanted to do it our way.
Right.
So nobody was prepared to go down and be formed by a producer or something like that, into a sound. We were a cohesive band, and everybody had an equal say in it. Naturally, different people carried different weight in the band. But obviously, what was different than a lot of them is we played on all our own tracks, for better or worse. It was us on there, no subs coming in and all of that. And like I say, the in-person performances built up your audience. And this was because of the advent of all-night FM radio that had turned from being classical music stations into all-night DJ play what we want stations. Made a huge difference in our career, and people like us. That's the point where we said, okay, we're not going to don't have to depend on AM radio, whether we've got a 2.5-minute single. They're going to play the longer cuts and cuts with more interesting music and maybe a more interesting topic to be played on all-night radio, because our audiences were staying up all night long.
Right.
Along with us. But that was without that, you wouldn't have had people playing Cream and Grateful Dead, and the whole Beatles album all at once, one stroke and all of that kind of stuff. That wouldn't have happened.
That time period, I'm not talking about the Summer of Love, but I mean before that, like around the time of the Be In, January 67.
Give me a year.
January 67. So before the Summer of Love.
That was the beginning of it all, yeah.
Yeah, so the Human Be In. Can you talk to me about what the hate was like at that time before it was overrun by people looking for the answer?
It was a small community. It was kind of, you were in New York. What was Soho like then? You see, you're too young to remember what Soho was like during the folk and jazz world days of the late 50s, early 60s. It was like that. It was a community of people that you saw a lot of the same people at the clubs, people that went to coffee houses afterwards and talked about what they heard or something like that. They shared books. Have you read this book? Have you read that book? Like City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco, or the Beat Generation coming out that. In a certain way, a lot of that was the Beat Generation with the older brothers, we were the younger brothers of the Beat Generation that have moved into music, a different world.
When you think back to that time, do you get a warm glow, or do you think are you manufacturing nostalgia when you look back? Is it not really as amazing?
Oh no, after all, but you're coming of age too, and you're coming into your own responsibility. You get your own apartment, and you're on your own. You're beginning life as a young adult, and those are exciting times, and you're on your own. It certainly wasn't like the corporation where you put it into a slotted little unit inside a big building with a bunch of co-workers and all of that.
Well, not only that, but you're having incredible incredible success as a young man. Plus, you're living through a time that has come to be recognized as a very important time in history, and you're right smack in the center of the...
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
but I remember all that beginning, the social movements and change out of the late 50s and early 60s in Washington, D.C. That was a big deal. I grew up in the center of power of Washington, D.C., and watching the movements start, and those civil rights movements start, that affected us in the household of who worked there and how it worked. It affected me playing those early clubs out in the R&B world and the African-American communities in Washington, D.C. as a 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old.
Yeah.
So all of that was going on and about to be, drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. So out in San Francisco, yes, it was a continuation of all of that.
Was LSD important to you?
Well, that's a rather odd jump from this conversation, but I mean, it was part of the lexicon, part of the landscape. It was important in many ways, I think, for the social consciousness of the group of people that was coming of age out there. But it had a lifespan of its own. It was, in a way, if I can say, it was kind of separate. It still didn't make or break whether I was a musician.
Sure.
Did it affect some things? Yeah. I mean, listening to Sketches of Spain on LSD, you bet. But it's the same time, I still listen to Sketches of Spain being straight as an arrow,
sure.
And it still had, the effect.
Just to let you know, I'm clean and sober, and, I don't do anything. But my LSD experiences, I do not discredit, because as much as I learned from going to an NA meeting, I learned a tremendous amount. And in fact, I have disagreements with my sponsor about this notion. He actually lived in San Francisco. He played with Boz Scaggs out there while you guys were coming up. And he discredits all his drug experiences. And
well, I mean, I frankly am not concerned about his experiences.
Right.
Time does funny things. People will accept or deny or put up a block. And in that circumstance that you just described, actually you shouldn't be describing, because you shouldn't be describing meetings. I can understand why he might put a block up like that for his own self-preservation.
Right.
I wouldn't read it like you just read it myself. LSD, absolutely. I mean, I was connected in on the bottom ground of all that with Owsley Stanley. I couldn't have been much more in the bottom ground of it.
Right.
At the same time, Owsley Stanley and I developed the first modification on the Guild Starfire bass with electronics, Owsley wasn't a genius because of LSD, but he certainly thought LSD played a part in expanding his awareness of certain things.
How long were you with Melissa Cargill?
Well, we sort of jumped to that, but yeah, a few years.
Okay.
Definitely. So I raised my stepdaughter, Redbird,
right,
is Owsley's biological daughter, but my daughter. And so we were together for a number of years. And so I saw the inner workings of all of that going on at the same time. We had time off. But that wasn't my scene, so to speak,
right,
because my job was playing the bass guitar.
Right.
Musician, So all of this, lots of things, any more than, I know a lot of the artists and Griffin Mouth and all the guys, that did post art. It was always fascinating with those guys that came out of the art world and did all of the post art, the Zap comic world, all the commentary that was going on. There was a whole community built up. You had comic books out commenting in an issue of what had just happened a few months before,
right,
making comments in it that you'd read about, from the third person, so to speak. And you had, in the fashion world, the audience improvising their apparel in a free-form fashion that matched the free-form music that was being played on stage, And you had a lot of different people that expected stuff, and it didn't require a lot of money. My little round glasses that I got were from a used shop in the 20s.
Right.
So, what was exciting about me remembering back to those days, those 5 or 7 years, is the immense amount of stuff that we did within a 7-year period.
Right.
I mean, don't forget, then and Hot Tuna was starting up in 68. But Jorma and I started playing together various songs that would become staples of Hot Tuna. long before that, just sitting around a hotel room playing because maybe they didn't work in the format of Jefferson Airplane. It wasn't, a Reverend Gary Davis song. We probably wouldn't approach with the musicians that we had in Jefferson Airplane. There was so much other material to be worked on, so it wasn't even thought about it. We just went over and played because of the sheer joy and love of playing. It wasn't until we played in front of a few people that we realized, hey, we got a different sound going on here, as Jorma and Jack playing, and which later on morphed into an actual band called Hot Tuna.
Yeah. Now, before we move on to the next record, there's only one other thing about the lifestyle at the time that I'm curious, as a man who, is at a different point in his life looking back on that time. I'm curious about your perspective on free love at the time. Do you think, looking back, no, really, because this is not the reality that I grew up in. Looking back,
I had to grow up in that reality either. So many of my friends got married at 18.
Yeah. Yeah. But Grace obviously is kind of in the sense that she was with everyone except for Marty, ultimately at some points during the band.
You got to relax. You got to pull it back a notch here. That was all absolutely going on. And yes, because you had such a huge community where it seemed to all be going on, but all I have to do is refer to one song called Triad to see how that doesn't work out.
Right.
We'd laugh about it later on. Of course, free love was a fantasy for only those that thought they could pull it off. The reality was something else quite different,
That's what I'm curious about.
When couples form and whatnot, jealousies form and you can only, handle so much of that. If both are playing the action, maybe it's okay, but usually one doesn't want to. And then it's not okay.
That's what I'm curious about, yeah.
I don't think you have to be too curious about it. The answers are pretty obvious. But was it all going on? Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it would be a failed experiment, only because of those jealousies don't go away.
Because of the obvious.
Right.
Because of the obvious, buddy. We're all grown up here.
So May 22nd, 1967 is the date that marked the beginning of what turned out to be your most epic stretch of recording as a band, which is the day that you guys recorded the first version of The Ballad of You and Me and Punil. And Paul has said, up until then, we kind of inflicted ourselves into the process, but we didn't overtake it. By the third album, we were doing acid in the studio and bringing in motorcycles.
Somewhat.
Sure.
Some were, somewhat. Most weren't, because you can't record well on it. Grateful Dead will tell you about that too, and all those guys. But were other people taking acid? Absolutely. When you say we're doing acid in the studio, but the reality was we probably weren't recording doing acid in the studio.
Right.
That's something. Might have been listening back. But it did give us an opportunity to indulge ourselves in a ridiculous opposite direction than Surrealistic Pillow, because once with the success of Surrealistic Pillow, then we stepped in there producing ourselves. It wasn't Tommy Oliver producing us, wanting to get a hit song, and Tommy made an incredible sound come out of that Surrealistic Pillow that holds up today.
Right.
In my opinion, that sound is more significant of a time era than any of the other albums that we made. Whether I wouldn't want to repeat that sound, but that use of echo and the sound in that studio, like in sound on Today or something like that, coming back to me, it's awesome.
Yeah.
But when we did After Bathing at Baxter, which was done over, I think, a 2.5 month period, with us going out on the road in the meantime to do concerts and all that. So we'd work on Sunday album, go out, and come back. We really indulged ourselves in the lockout. We were able to afford. What happened is we renegotiated our contract to include us as producers as well, so that we could have the final say in the studio. And God bless him, Al Schmidt started coming with us in those and he was wonderful.
Yeah, so Al seems instrumental. So what was it that
absolutely, he's a genius at also allowing us and giving us plenty of rope, in some cases rope to hang ourselves. But
well, I mean,
at the same time,
all the hanging stuff, that album is very special to me. And I'm guessing it's your favorite studio album by the band.
Well, I don't really look at it that way. I really don't look at favorites or whatnot. There's such learning curves in the development for me personally as a musician. Yeah. Crown of Creation, when the indulgence of After Bathing at Baxter faded with nothing being played on a regular radio and all that, we went back to tightening up our sound. using a lot of stuff we learned with that.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, Crown of Creation, I thought, matched more of the kind of the songwriting, the cohesiveness, and the sound we were getting in person in Crown of Creation. So what I liked is the freedom on After Bathing at Baxter's, and the feeling that we could really dive into the studio atmosphere and create something that was the sound that we got there. And we weren't trying to mimic some sound that we got out in the open on concert stage into the studio. We really walked into that world. And of course, for me to be able to play a bass break and prunail or spare change and, put a jam on it, we never thought that would end up on the album until
Right.
all the material was done. And luckily, those people like Marty and Paul and Grace, who were the singers who worked on songs, so to speak, we gave the musicians their due by allowing that stuff, by all saying, yeah, we put it on the album, why not?
Right. I know a lot has been made in the band's history, and I think you're going to reprimand me for bringing this up, but so much has been made about the marginalization of Marty's material by this point in the band's history, after he'd really been behind the wheel for Surrealistic Pillow. Did you ever wind up growing a late-in-the-game appreciation for Marty's work?
Oh, I always have. I mean, but like when I said before, the strength and the weakness of Jefferson Airplane. The strength was that everybody had a lot to contribute. The weakness is only so much can fit on an album and a stage in one night. So when Jorma's songwriting started to come up, so you got Jorma, you got Grace, you got Paul, you got Marty, and then you got Jack, who wants to make his instrumental approaches unique. So trying for it, Marty's wrote fantastic songs after the Jefferson Airplane. I mean, the Miracles and all of that, and the Hearts and all in his career. But there was a little less for me to do as a bass player, and Marty really liked a good steady bass behind it. And when we were at the height of trying to develop my musical palette to expand into areas and come up with combinations of notes, and Marty's songs at that time didn't fit into that. Now, I played some stuff later on after that in the 90s with Marty and did some shows with him out there. And then I thoroughly, as I've always enjoyed his songs, I thought he wrote some of the best songs and in person. But don't forget, he's developing too. Mm-hmm. And he's trying to develop into a songwriter where he can get to some point of where he's headed. And that may not improve a lot of improvisation behind his basic tracks where he's singing the lyrics and the composition of song. So I think with all of that moving at the same time, that's just what happened.
Right.
And so there's only so much time to get all that done.
Right.
And so from my viewpoint, it wasn't that I didn't dislike Marty's songs. There was just a little less there's a lot less for me to do on it, but it's still unique and still a challenge to try to figure out the right thing to do for his song.
Yeah.
But then I think within his world, and I can't speak for Marty, I think the areas that he wanted to expand to were not necessarily the areas that were available to him in Jefferson Airplane.
Right.
But as you saw later on with Miracles, with Jefferson Starship, I mean, that was a humongous area that a very creative, extremely creative song that had so many sections and parts to it. And I think that, you're not ready till you're ready,
Right,
and
right.
So
yeah.
I don't think we quite thought of it in the right manner you just presented it to me, but we were just not slowing down for anybody. And so, with Grace's songs, I probably had the greatest challenges with chord because she, with her classical background, she really had unique chord structures that I found. There's songs like Lawman,
Rejoice. Rejoice is wild.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And she, God bless her, would give me a complete free hand. I'd sit down with her at the piano and she'd block the song out for me. And I'd sit there with the bass and go all that, and then I'd go to work on it, go to tone it. And sometimes I'd do it with the versatone, the sustain and all that. I tried to put my idea for those kinds of things, and with Paul sounds too, were to put almost like classical music tracks on it, as if they were string sections, only I was doing the roar of the bass.
Yeah, I love your work on her tracks. One of my favorite songs, and this is a sentence that's not uttered very often, but the title track of Long John Silver is one of my all-time favorite Jefferson Airplane songs. Your work together.
Oh, really? I hardly ever hear that.
I know, look, the last two records do not have the same magic as the rest of the albums, for me at least, but that title track is phenomenal. I love that song, and I feel like the the way that you and Grace traditionally clicked comes together in that song.
That's fascinating because all I had was this bass, like they would basically sound like an Irish jig or something. You know?
Yes.
And so we laughed about it. Here's my Irish background. Yeah. And then she jumped into, I said, would you work on that? Because I was playing it around as a warm-up lick all the time and all that. I'm just so grateful to have that opportunity and those periods of time in my development of my 20s, you know, getting up in the early 30s, to have that 7-year period with Jefferson Airplane. Otherwise, like I say, if you don't get a chance to try these ideas and develop ideas and have the freedom to do it, then, you know, it's lost.
Yeah. And along with that freedom and some really different people in the same band that you would never find. I mean, you know, you got Paul saying Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker, while Marty is, you know, singing Today and Coming Back to Me. That tension is what makes Jefferson Airplane so interesting.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, you're right.
So in 67, I don't know when exactly the factions start to come out into the scene, but it seems like around that time period of Baxter's, and from an outsider's perspective, looking at the factions changing when Spencer was with Grace and then when Paul was with Grace and what that would do with the dynamic shifts in the band.
You know, it's probably all true, I'm sure. At the end of the day, I have to say, so what?
No, well, I'm just saying when
you know, I mean, you're a writer. You want to know more the human element. I mean, definitely. I mean, there was definitely factions of Jorma and I, and then Grace and Spencer for a while, Grace and Marty, and Grace on her own, and then Grace in 1970 had China. You know, so there's a family dynamic that's entered into it, and time has to be taken off. While that's going on, Hot Tuna's developed because we had more time on our hands. Paul was never a road warrior to begin with, so he had his limitations about how many shows he wanted to do on the road and whatnot. And his philosophy, and most bands, you don't write new stuff out on the road. You only write about being out on the road. And so there was periods, you know, that would have that in it. There was a natural period when that was done that Jorma and I get together and we go out and play in little clubs around San Francisco, and eventually worked itself into a format where we could book shows.
So you're probably aware of this, but more than 50 years later, you and Jorma, it's just the two of you and Stephen Stills, who are the only currently active musicians who played Monterey Pop, Woodstock, and Altamont. So at the time, did any of those shows stand out particularly, or were they all in their various ways pretty much the same, but then later on they were attributed various accolades with the slant of history? All right, that about does it. For over 4 years now, Discograffiti's Friday episodes have been completely free, and it's been my pleasure. But for a variety of reasons, Discograffiti's now moved to the subscription-based Patreon as our primary platform. Moving forward, our public stream will feature a teaser of the Friday episode and a Tuesday teaser of the bonus episode, and that's all. But here's the good news. Only $5 a month will get you the weekly Friday podcast to which you become accustomed. That's it. It's a no-brainer at just $1 an episode. And just that little bit will be what's required to help the show survive. To sweeten the pot, you'll also get regular installments of the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. That's Rudy Fishman's podcast within a podcast featuring our Patreon members as guests. You'll also get access to over 100 back episodes of that show. The $10 Lieutenant tier gets you all that, plus access to half of the Patreon archive. That's hundreds of additional episodes, plus copies of my personal show notes, which include invaluable research, star ratings, and reviews. But the $20 major tier is the place to be, unless you can support the show on even higher tiers, which, if you can afford it, offers substantial perks, including advertising on the show and selecting the guests and artists I cover. With the major tier and above, you get it all. The Monday bonus episodes, aka the best stuff, the Friday show, the Soldiers of Sound podcast, plus access to the entire archive. That's many hundreds of Patreon episodes, an absolutely endless barrage of music entertainment, including 50 episodes of The Private Press with Paul Major, Rock Cousteau, Queasy Listening, and so much more. So support the podcast that's been supporting you for years. Discograffiti's calling, and it needs you, so don't risk feeling guilty by not giving. But enough of me yapping. Go on, subscribe now. Visit patreon.com/discograffiti and find the tier that's right for you. Stay tuned, because next week brings upon us the second installment of Feed Your Head, the Great Jefferson Airplane Deep Dive. It's part 2 of my epic interview with the great Jack CASADY. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the major tier gets a very special treat. Monday's bonus episode is part 13 of our love series, which covers both For Sale and Out Here. It's the end of the Elektra era and the introduction of Love Mark II, which gives Joe Kennedy and I the opportunity to take a good hard look at some damn fine and vastly underrated music. There will be a very short sneak peek running publicly for free on Tuesday morning, but the entirety of the show will only be accessible on the major tier of our Patreon. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful son Mason, Jack CASADY, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, my mom, my dad, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, and access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the amniotically dark and cozy psychedelic underworld of the 60s and 70s is to leap headfirst into our Spirit series. That's episodes 241 to 249, the Lenny Waronker interview, that's 244 and 245, our ongoing Graham Nash interview in which he talks about everything he's ever done, our 13-episode Moby Grape series featuring interviews with Peter Lewis, Don Stevenson, and Bob Mosley. That's episodes 208 to 214. The Beatles' Pete Best. That's episode 188. Our free design interview with all the Dedrick siblings. That's 160 to 162. Our Mamas and Papas series featuring my 16-hour Michelle Phillips interview, which she says is the best interview she's ever done. That's episodes 141 to 159. My 13-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander about everything the association ever did. That's 109 to 113. My interview with Vashti Bunyan about her life and everything she's ever recorded, that's 103 to 104. My interview with Os Mutants Sergio Diaz, that's 86 and 87. Lou Barlow on the Zombies, that's 59 and 60. Foxygen's Jonathan Rado on Todd Rundgren, that's 37 and 40. Anthony Fantano on the Velvet Underground, that's 32 and 33. Bob Forrest on the band, that's 25 and 27. Andrew Sandoval on the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randy on David Axelrod, that's episode 17. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, May 8th, we're coming at you with part 2 of my epic interview with Jack CASADY. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!